I mean, reliability is essential. People die every time the power goes out for various reasons, especially in bigger blackouts. But like I said, it's sort of a race because maybe if we can get better at building nuclear and build nuclear fast enough, then maybe we can deploy it at a rate that will be able to sort of swoop in before things get particularly bad.
Hello, I am Cody Allingham, and this is the Transformation of Value, a place for thinkers and builders, where together we explore freedom, energy, and creativity through the lens of Bitcoin and long-term thinking. In this episode, I am joined by Nick Touran, a nuclear engineer, educator, and founder of whatisnuclear.com. We talk about the nuanced reality of nuclear energy, its history, and the current political, economic, and regulatory challenges globally, as well as the outlook for nuclear reactor technology and energy abundance more broadly. Now, this show is supported by you. My vision is to make the transformation of value into something that we can take with us into the future. If you want to help me grow this show, please consider making a donation either through my website or by tipping directly to the show's Bitcoin wallet. If you have any questions or feedback, I would love to hear from you. Part of what makes this show special is when people contact me. You can always email me at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. Otherwise, on to the show. Well, look, Nick, thank you for joining me today. I thought we could start off by way of introduction. If you could share a bit about your background and your involvement with nuclear energy, please.
Sure, yeah, of course. So, my background in nuclear, I mean, I grew up in Michigan and I became very interested in energy in general in high school. I didn't really know what to do with that, but this is back in turn of the millennium or whatever. And I really wanted to do something. I knew energy was a big deal. And so I went to the good local engineering school, which happened to be University of Michigan. And as I was there looking for energy related stuff, I went to a peer advisor and said, what can I do that's energy related? And she said, well, we have a nuclear department. You could try nuclear. And I was like, geez, I mean, I never even thought about it. It was kind of it wasn't cool. It wasn't, anything that was up and coming, but, I could take the class and do a requirement or whatever. And so I thought I'd try it out. So I tried the class and I was just blown away at what I learned, all the different capabilities and what had been done in nuclear and what could happen now. And the fact that it was sort of a low carbon baseload energy source really just excited me. So I declared the major. I became really interested in originally fusion. I was interested in fusion and I worked in a fusion lab as an undergrad, just kind of working for a grad student. But eventually switched over to advanced fission. So fission, splitting atoms, but using more exotic types of coolants and so on. So that became my thing as a grad student and through my PhD. And then that just sort of transitioned. I was doing PhD research on a pretty obscure type of nuclear reactor. And it just so happened that a company came along, TerraPower. Actually, it was called Intellectual Ventures back then, that was looking specifically for people who knew how to do simulations, computer simulations of that type of reactor. So they called me, they called my research group and said like, hey, I see you can do this kind of work. Can you teach us? So I came out actually as an intern, or no, as a consultant at first. And then I downgraded to an intern and then took a full-time job and have been there for the last 15 years. So I've been doing mostly doing core design at TerraPower. That was my first 10 years or so. Wrote a lot of software that helps figure out where the neutrons are, how to move the fuel around, where the heat's being generated and all that. And then more recently, I sort of wanted to try something a little bit different. So I switched over into more of a software, less nuclear specific engineering. I'm doing like databases that control what the design of the plant is and who's allowed to change it. And if you change something, who else you have to call. So I got much more interested in the problems of nuclear construction, why they're expensive and how to solve them. And sorry, one more thing. Along all this way, back as an undergrad at Michigan, I made this website, whatisnuclear.com, with my friends. We thought, geez, if people knew about nuclear, they would be so much more excited and we would have so much more nuclear power. And so we made this website again, whatisnuclear.com, that was just supposed to sort of be an exposure to what is nuclear, what's it about, what's good and bad about it, and so on. And that's I've kept that going for all these years, and it's been fun to add to. And I've added all sorts of not. It goes well beyond introductory stuff. Now there's like deep dives into history and weird reactor types and everything that I get interested in. I just publish on there. And over COVID, I kind of got into tweeting about it and built up a couple followers. And so anyway,
Yeah.
that's the overall background.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I find it interesting. So you've got this background with the engineering side, but you've also done, and you are doing quite a lot of software stuff as well. So did you study that as well, or is that something you picked up along the way?
I picked it up along the way. I've been interested in software since I was pretty young. I mean, my dad had one of these Osborne 1 computers, which is like a really early like suitcase computer from the 80s. And I asked him what on earth he did with that, and he showed me how to write a program in Microsoft Basic. I wrote a couple, dumb programs, just count and so on. So I wrote a few programs as a kid and then dropped it for a while. But then in college, I picked it back up, really got into Python as sort of something that could help me solve engineering problems. And that became like a almost a trademark for me. Like I really I learned a lot. I mean, I read the books and I learned a lot from great people, but it was not formal training. I just picked up a bunch of software stuff along the way. And then all the work at TerraPower was really wrapped around this simulation framework that we made that could automate the different simulations and pass data from one to the other. And we ended up actually open sourcing a big chunk of that. It's called Army with an I. So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, mostly self-taught, but it's been extremely useful, and it's fun to have that intersection of software for something as sort of physical as nuclear power.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Would you call it like a digital twin type project, or
Yeah, it's a lot of it. It's the foundation of a digital twin, and that so far we've just been running simulations. So we have the model and we have the simulations, and we can interpolate and extrapolate. The thing we're missing from my formal definition of a digital twin would be sensor data coming in from physical hardware. So once we go farther into construction and we plug in sensor data or reality capture or whatever, then it's a full-on digital twin. But now it's sort of the prerequisite to a digital twin with the
yeah.
data management and the simulations.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. Well, look, I did spend quite a bit of time reading through your whatisnuclear.com
All
website,
right.
which has some great and quite accessible resources for learning about nuclear
Nice.
energy. It also addresses some of the common concerns people may have and questions. I actually went down some rabbit holes myself, learning about the first nuclear reactors. There was one in the UK and the different types of reactors. So I spent a bit of time doing that. But what really strikes me is that nuclear energy is something with a high degree of complexity and nuance. And actually the nature of the electrical grid itself is also quite complex. And it seems like maybe some of the concerns or questions people have come maybe not so much from a logical or a rational place, but perhaps more of an emotional or political place. And this can be a little bit difficult to work with as we're trying to make progress. And so throwing that to you, how do we approach the nuclear conversation, Nick?
Yeah, it certainly is. It's challenging. I think it must be like a human evolution thing. Like we don't judge risks like mathematically. Like we don't look at fossil fuel and see that it's emitting particulates as it runs under normal operation and causes something like 8 million early deaths per year. We don't factor that in. Like even though we have scientists who tell us that that's happening, and you then say, well, you have a nuclear plant down the road that could have an accident and that accident could cause harm. That somehow is much more scary. I think it comes back to like what we evolved with. I mean, we evolved to be afraid of like lions on the savannah or whatever, and things that can jump out at you. And it's much harder. We just don't have the capacity to really understand big uh, sort of global health challenges. I mean, we're getting better. I mean, the conversation around climate change, for instance, has obviously turned in the last 20 years or so. So maybe conversations around things like safety in nuclear and long-term storage of nuclear waste, maybe there's a chance that we can talk about those rationally. But right now, I mean, well, right now I will say nuclear is much more popular than it's been in probably the last 20 years that I can remember. There are a lot of things that have lined up for it, but still we have plenty of opposition. There's lots of conservatism in the licensing and the various the designs themselves are quite conservative. So yeah, how do we change the conversation? I mean, another aspect of it is like changing the conversation is important probably, but maybe more important is like just getting the costs under control and getting them down. That's coupled to how, the conversations with the public about how much safety you have to put into the plant. But like you look at a natural gas turbine, nobody is like I don't know. No one's like a fanboy of natural gas turbine. Maybe they are, but they're just cheap. They're easy to build. They're reliable. There's lots of fuel for them now, at least in the United States. And so utilities love them. It takes a couple people to operate. You just build it. It's always the same price. You put it, it's a jet engine bolted to the ground. You ramp it up and ramp it down. If not for climate change or fossil fuel, all the health effects of fossil fuel, they're a great product and they're very popular. But since we have climate change and air pollution, we want to try to get rid of those. But so I kind of think, in a sense, if we could make nuclear power plants that easy to build, that easy to operate, then utilities would choose them as an option for their benefits, in the sense that they're those things plus low carbon plus not requiring fossil fuel. So anyway, I kind of threw two answers at you.
It's okay. And I mean, I guess if I can start maybe then pulling on that thread with natural gas, how does that stack up against, say, coal in terms of base load and peak of plants? Are they and climate impact?
Well, yeah, they're both bad from a climate perspective. So, and the answer to that is going to depend a lot on it's region dependent to a degree. I mean, the United States because of fracking and horizontal drilling, we have access to like this vast amount of very cheap natural gas through a pretty destructive process, not terribly destructive, but fairly destructive fracking and horizontal drilling. And so we're shutting down all our coal plants and basically replacing them with gas plants. Gas plants can ramp up and down very quickly. With the combined cycle, they are very thermally efficient, so they can convert a lot of their heat into electricity. In terms of air pollution, direct air pollution, natural gas is dramatically better from a health perspective than coal because it doesn't have the particulate emissions or the SOx and NOx that really cause the respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. So it's much cleaner burning. It's sort of a simpler molecule. But from a climate perspective, well, on the face of it, it looks like coal emits something like 800 grams CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, and natural gas is like 480, so a little bit more than half. But there's this whole issue of emissions from the pipelines. So when you have a natural gas system, you have all these pipes and they have valves, and they're leaking pure unburned methane. Natural gas is mostly methane, and that's a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So when you look at the total effect of running like a full natural gas system versus a coal system, depending on which model you're looking at, they're basically just as bad as each other from a climate change perspective. They're both quite bad, as bad as it gets. But yeah, natural gas generally cleaner from a straight up health air pollution perspective. And I mean, you can make a coal plant cleaner by installing really fancy filters, bag houses, and scrubbers and so on, but that adds cost as well. And anyway, it's just hard to get as good as natural gas. So yeah, that's how that is.
No, interesting. And just because I do want to pull on the economics of this a little bit, but with natural gas, can you tell me as well, does that generally require you to be on site with the natural gas or pipe it somehow? Can you transport it? Or?
Generally, you need to be plugged into a pipeline network and it's delivered on demand. So it's basically like the grid, but instead of electrons, it's like pressurized natural gas coming down the pipeline. That's how almost all natural gas plants operate. It can be transported in liquid form in these ships. They have these massive cryogenic ships. You have to cool it way down, to
LNG.
Yeah, LNG. Yeah. So you have these huge domed ships that you may have seen that you can transport. You can load it onto those ships and ship it all around. And we ship it. I mean, the world ships lots of liquefied natural gas around. And then you can unloaded into tanks, but it still is going to get to the plants through pipelines. There's no like truck or train of LNG that shows up at the plant and gets it's always through a pipeline network.
Yeah. So there's a broader, I guess, supply chain consideration here for what goes into these plants because, yeah, you say the United States has access to this, but I live in Japan right now, and I'm
Yeah.
thinking of other parts of the world that maybe don't have access to those
Yeah.
pipelines, or they don't have as much resources available. And how is that going to work? Certainly
Yeah.
politically as well. I know places like Europe and they're trying to build these LNG facilities, which are quite expensive as well. And you end up accruing a lot of supply chain cost as well. So interesting dynamic there, whereas nuclear, I mean, it's relatively site independent, right? You can build them if you've got the right conditions, but
Yes, yes. That's so
tell me
that's
tell me about that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, and yeah, just from like a coal and nuclear are similar in that you can have like a lot of fuel sort of on site, especially nuclear. I mean, you can have 3 years of nuclear fuel sort of in a big dump truck because it's such an energy dense fuel. Whereas with a coal plant, you generally need like a mile long train of coal per day to be delivered. So you need lots of logistics for that. But your questions mostly is just about like what's it take to build a nuclear plant in a from a regional point of view. Yeah, so you need, I mean, like you said earlier, it's a fairly sophisticated technology. So you need some, well, but that doesn't prevent anything. So there's lots of let's see, there's around just a little bit more than 400 commercial nuclear power plants all around the world. Many countries have them. Generally, to build one, you're gonna want to establish like a nuclear regulatory capability in your country, which a lot of countries do. The UAE is the most recent new nuclear running country, and it took them something like 15 years. They said like we're gonna build nuclear, and they brought in a bunch of people from different institutions. They talked to the IAEA, which is the UN nuclear often kind of called the watchdog, but they also help people establish nuclear capabilities in their country. So IAEA has a whole set of tools and documents that sort of lay out exactly what you need to do to get started with nuclear. And so you'll start with your regulatory people, you'll start training folks who are going to work, your people who have you working there. You have to find appropriate sites, and those sites, maybe there's different characterizations. Like you can be near ocean, you can be near a river. The seismic activity of the site is gonna change what plant you choose or how much you seismically isolate or seismically reinforce your plant. So you have to figure out what site you're going to go at, and that plays into your design. And then generally a new entrant, a country who's just started in nuclear will generally buy a plant design from a vendor like Westinghouse or GEH, or you can get them from China, Russia, or Europe. Framatome has a few. So you put out a bid, and like Poland's doing this right now. You say like, "Hey, who wants to sell me a reactor? This is the site. This is how many I want." And companies will say like, "Hey, use my reactor. And they all have different models that they'll try to sell you, and you pick the one that works best for you. And in the UAE, they chose a Korean design called the APR 1400, and then they partnered with the Korean manufacturing team. So like Korea sent over thousands of people who had built this type of reactor before, and they worked side by side with the Emiratis, and they built these four plants one after the other. Meanwhile, they established their regulatory capability. They established a utility that knows how to operate the plants, and they turned them on. So they've just turned on their fourth big gigawatt scale reactor.
Yeah, I'm keen to pull on that as well, this regulatory operational stuff. But I think just taking a step back to the natural gas conversation and this development of fracking, which seemed to have had quite a profound effect on the trajectory of nuclear, because you had obviously the oil shocks in the 70s and a lot of challenges around energy in the 1970s, which I think led to a lot of conversations, including actually in my home country of New Zealand. There was talk about nuclear, and there was some reports put out in the late 70s around what nuclear could mean, because you had such incredibly high prices for oil, yet this all sort of seemed to change as fracking came along. So can you tell me a little bit about that whole situation, please?
Yeah, it's it's had a major impact. When I was back in that earlier story, when I was an undergrad making whatisnuclear.com, we were in what was called the nuclear renaissance at the time, and there were orders for dozens of new nuclear plants just in the United States alone. But like right when they were about to start getting built, this fracking situation happened. And it happened pretty quick. I mean, and it just zeroed out. It used to be the natural gas prices were well known to be extremely volatile. Like, yeah, it could be cheap sometimes, but when went up, the prices would swing just like crazy and they would become very expensive. So it was never considered a long-term fuel that you could really depend on. But because of fracking, it became clear, and people were selling 20-year futures, where you could buy contracts for natural gas 20 years later, and with a very low, very secure price. So that totally shifted the game again because those natural gas turbines, they're basically just jet engines, big jet engines bolted to the ground with a throttle. They're like almost that simple. It's a little more than that, but they're super simple. Yeah, go ahead.
And so that's why they're so easy to ramp the load as well.
Yeah,
Because yeah,
yeah, you can throttle up and down a jet engine, no problem, and it's basically the same mechanism.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
and so just as well, so this fracking. So you're saying this is maybe more like in the 2000s. So there was
yeah, this is like 2006 and 7 is when it really kicked in, and then it like carried through 6, 7, and then like prices went down, and then they stayed low through for the next maybe 10 years at least, and like all those nuclear plants in the US basically got canceled because I mean the gas was just a better deal at the time, and no one was really taking the climate impact stuff seriously, at least at that time. It's becoming more serious now. But it's not priced in. Like natural gas is not paying for the damage, for climate change or anything like that.
Yeah, well, because I interviewed Kenji Tateiwa recently on the show, and he was working on nuclear in the US in the early 2000s. And unfortunately, Fukushima came along as well, and then obviously the pricing and the economics of it. But yeah, as you say, there was this period. And so, sort of, would you say then it was prior to that, say, well, 1980s on to early 2000s? Is that sort of the era we talk about as the Renaissance of nuclear?
Well, so the Renaissance was, I mean, the first thing I've heard of the Renaissance was really, it was like 2006, 7, 8 was like when it was going to happen. Like we were going to build all these plants, but then, yeah, it was like 8, 9, 10, and 11, natural gas because of fracking went down and Fukushima happened. And those two things together killed that first Renaissance. But no, in the 80s and 90s, I mean, coal was kind of king at the time. Like nuclear was doing great until maybe the late 70s when costs of building plants became very high for a variety of reasons. There were labor shortages, construction performance wasn't nearly as good, interest rates went way up, and we had the accident at 3 Mile Island, which scared people. There were other incidents as well that happened in the mid 70s that caused major changes in how plants are built, more redundancy, more fireproofing, better quality assurance, a lot of things that drove costs up before 3 Mile Island. So we kind of had leveled off building nuclear by the late 70s. And so most of the growth was coming from basically coal. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until like the late 2000 zeros that the natural gas really took off like crazy.
Interesting. So we had 3 Mile Island. There was an issue there in '79, but you're saying there was safety issues or safety questions asked prior to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, there were, we had built a big fleet and there were things that happened. Like there's something called, like there was a fire that happened in a control room because someone was checking for a leak. And the way they were checking for a leak by some wires was that they held a candle up to where the wires go through the wall to see if the flame, goes in or out. And when it went in but the insulation of the cable was made with a flammable material. And so the whole thing, all the insulation burned and the wires started connecting and the control room was totally disconnected from the plant. They couldn't shut it down. So it was like this really bad incident where like it didn't end up causing any the other plant systems handled it at that time, but it was a very significant event. I think that was 1975, and that caused major changes in fire protection regulations, material of insulation, and basically redundancy in the control room. So if you have some wires that are totally shorted out on one side, you have to have a totally redundant set on the other side in case there's a fire type situation. So
Mm.
that kind of thing right there really there was numerous other incidents along those lines that were leading to changes in design and cost escalations beyond the external things like again interest rate and labor issues.
Interesting, yeah, because you've got a really good timeline here around
Mhm.
some of these economic factors, and many of these cost increases were due to some serious incidents, weren't exactly meltdowns, and this was prior
Yeah.
to 3 Mile Island,
Yeah.
and then obviously the interest rates, labor costs, and other factors, and potentially even the cost of oil as well, maybe factored into supply chains and getting concrete and all sorts of the resources in for the actual builds themselves, I imagine.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so there's different factors here, and then you talk about the regulatory side, which I think is very interesting because
Mhm.
you talk about the UAE just got on board, and it's this 15-year process, and it seems like there's quite a lot of compliance cost. Maybe not quite the same for building natural gas combined cycle turbines or coal facilities, etc. So, I mean, what are the differences between the costs of build outs in terms of compliance and regulation?
Um, that's a great question. I don't think I have hard numbers, but it's
Okay.
certainly much harder. I mean, from for like a kilowatt by kilowatt basis, the regulatory regime, and each country can choose their own regulations, how they want, but most follow the US NRC as like a guideline. And this UN organization, the IAEA, does also have like a set of criteria that are pretty generic and used everywhere. I would say, I mean, yeah, that's the regulatory cost in nuclear is very high and it's pretty low. Well, it's high in coal. Like coal does have we in the US we have something called the Clean Air Act, which really caused a lot of emission control systems to be put on coal, which were very expensive. They doubled the cost of coal plants at least. Um, but for a natural gas plant, like, yeah, they still have to comply with all the environmental regulations, but it's just easier naturally to not emit as much stuff because it's just a cleaner burning fuel. So the regulatory cost for a natural gas plant is quite low, and it's very high for nuclear, and then like middle it would be coal, I would say. And that's pretty, I think it's not going to be the same in every single jurisdiction, but that's pretty much where they're going to end up.
Yeah, and I'm curious as well, just getting into maybe some of the political and awareness aspects
Hmm.
of this. This this question about nuclear and the role of nuclear facilities in development of the low grade fuel material used for energy and
Hmm.
reactors, and then the high grade material used for weapons is something that's maybe misunderstood by the public or quite a nuanced topic. But for
Hmm.
someone like the UAE to go and do this themselves, how does that relate to broader questions around proliferation and nuclear weapons? Yeah.
Yeah, great question. So it's all dependent on, well, so first of all, the plants the normal nuclear power plants are not, I mean, they could be used to make weapons material like plutonium, but they're not made for it. It'd be very hard to make weapons usable plutonium in that kind of reactor. That's one thing that's just nice about the types of reactors that we have making power these days. Whereas the first, like a lot of the early reactors, like the first power
Yeah,
producing
in
reactor
the UK.
in
Yeah.
the UK, their purpose was to make plutonium, but they just made electricity as sort of a byproduct.
Yeah.
And same in the Soviet Union, they had a small one that did that as well. But the types of reactors that they built are these pressurized water reactors just don't have that capability. You can make some plutonium, but it's low grade plutonium. It has a bunch of other isotopes of plutonium that make it less of an explosive material. But really, I mean, if you have neutrons, you can put uranium outside the neutrons, and when the neutrons go into the uranium, it will turn into plutonium. So, like, there is an element of proliferation concern for any operating nuclear power plant of any kind. And so, the solution we have for this is this: the IAEA has the part of the UN nuclear watchdog aspect of the IAEA is all done through international treaties and so on. They have the right to go in there and they inventory every piece of nuclear material you have, and they can come in whenever and they do all these inspections and they have fancy instruments and they can measure anti-neutrinos and all sorts of stuff to try to see if you're lying or if you're cooking the books or whatever. And they really track through bookkeeping, like how much uranium went in and how much comes out. And if you're diverting material for plutonium, then they would be able to find you, and then the UN would take action against you. So it's really this idea of safeguards and inspections is how we prevent people from secretly sneaking off and making some kind of weapons material if they have a plant. Now, I guess you can argue that there's like a risk there that like they could say like, well, we're going to start making plutonium and they can kick out the inspectors and they can start making plutonium and like maybe that would speed up their ability to jump into a weapon. But I mean, there's and like depending on your politics or whatever, there's like all sorts of you can send in the Israeli Air Force and they will, they've like gone in and bombed nuclear plants in other countries who have been making plutonium. That's not a great solution. It's very can lead to escalations and so on. But anyway, so it's through this inspection and safeguard that we sort of prevent that kind of concern.
Yeah, and that example you just gave, that was Iraq was working on a nuclear power plant. Was it in the 90s?
Yeah, I can't remember what year. I want to say like early 90s.
And the Israelis bombed that facility. And was it clear that there was weapons grade material being developed there, or was it more of a preventative thing? Do you know?
I don't want to speak to. I'm pretty sure it was clear. I think the purpose was to make plutonium, but I haven't read up on it recently, so I better not say too confidently.
No.
Yeah.
Well, this is interesting. So there's this. I guess there's this regulatory aspect, international watchdogs, and again, I don't know if that's something we see with other forms of energy production, where you have international bodies coming in and supervising.
Yeah, no, it's pretty unique. I mean, that sort of dual. I mean, every technology can be used for good or bad, but I think the sort of sheer capability of a nuclear weapon is sort of above and beyond. It's like nothing else has that level of sort of concern and risk. Or terror. Like nothing else can like wipe out civilization that quickly. So. Yeah, I mean that's just another burden on the nuclear stuff. And the IAEA inspectors are not a major cost driver, but it is a complication and a compliance thing that you do have to deal with.
Yeah. Well, so there's sort of maybe a couple of aspects here then. There's this political situation at the high level where there's questions about proliferation. There's also maybe the political question at the lower level where you've got the public maybe not understanding what's going on, or they have misconceptions. They've seen too many HBO specials, or they think of Mr. Burns and The Simpsons and these things. And then on the other side, you also have the economics. And I think between all of those, it's a very interesting combination that has led to perhaps the stagnancy. But the kind of thing that stands out is what has been carrying the load is natural gas for many years now. And what is the other side of that? So obviously we've talked about the climate change, and you say maybe relatively almost unlimited amounts of natural gas. Is that?
Well, I shouldn't say unlimited. I mean, it's vast amounts of gas is now economically achievable. Exactly how much is hard to predict, and people have tried to talked about peak oil and peak gas for many years, but no one saw like this advance in extraction technology. So, but yeah, I mean, we could certainly run. I mean, I would say at least 100 years. The U.S. Could run itself for at least that long. And yeah, now the US we were importing natural gas, but we just switched all our import ports into export terminals down sort of in the Gulf, down by Texas and so on. So we're now exporting natural gas to a bunch of places like Japan and to Europe, and all over the place. And that of course is much more expensive than the domestic gas because the shipping cost adds a lot. But there is a huge amount of natural gas, similar to, there's also a huge amount of coal in terms of what's out there. They're certainly non-renewable. They will run out at some point, or they will get very much more expensive to extract. When exactly that is unclear. But like for coal, I'd say the health impact certainly, should be enough cause for us to try to reduce it. And then we already mentioned the climate aspect. That's like the major driver for most people these days. Yeah.
Well, I think, a lot of this is coming from quite a North American centric point of view where Canada, the United States, there's, vast resources available. But again, if we come back to where nuclear is developing in terms of China, and Russia, and
Yeah.
mentioned South Korea, Japan as well, on pause at the moment. But these countries that maybe don't have the same amounts of reserve, though I imagine Russia has quite a lot of natural gas available.
Yeah, Russia has tons of natural gas, and they have these big pipelines that were
Yeah.
exporting it to Europe that then got blown up. But no, you're right. I mean, there's huge amounts of places in the world. Nigeria's population is headed up to 500 million in the next 20 or 30 years. So, and they have some resources, but the energy needs for sort of the global south and other parts of the world that aren't as energy or as rich in resources is a really serious and interesting thing to talk about. So, yeah, and I mean, like Japan is a classic example. There's very little natural resources from an energy perspective available in Japan, and so the fact that they built out a large nuclear fleet makes perfect sense. They were spearheading this breeder type reactor that can get much more efficient use out of the uranium that you get. You can get like 100 times more energy out of the same amount of uranium, and they had two reactors up and running that were working on that. So, I mean, yeah, it's like a great use case for that. Same with Korea. China has lots of resources, but also huge demand. So they're basically trying everything, and they are now building more nuclear plants than anybody else by far. So, yeah, and I mean, you talk about South America, there's a few reactors operating down there. And I'm not sure about plans to expand at the moment, but like that would be another pretty good place. They have plenty of oil in general down there, but it's also a pretty good place to consider building nuclear plants.
Yeah. Yeah.
There,
Sorry.
no, there's just one sort of interesting deployment mechanism I want to mention
Yeah.
is there's this concept of a power ship. So there's a Turkish company called like Karadeniz, something like that. And they have these big ships that have massive gas turbines on them, and they float them down to wherever. Like you can go to a disaster area or just a region that needs a lot of power but doesn't have a power plant. And you basically run a pipeline out to the ship, and it throws high voltage AC lines back. And you send fuel, and it sends electricity. And they have a bunch of them, and they take them around. There's one operating off the shore of Ghana right now. There have been some in Iraq, it's just a really interesting concept because it's just this like power plant that shows up. But if you do it with a nuclear plant, so imagine somebody manufactures a nuclear powered power ship or a bunch of them, and then those can go off and they could operate. Maybe they're flagged in wherever, like their home country, the US or China or whatever, India, and they can go and park offshore from some country that has a major power demand. That reactor can be regulated by the home country plus the regional area as needed. And you can sort of do a power purchase agreement, and that way you could get nuclear electricity while you're still ramping up the nuclear infrastructure. It's kind of an interesting way to sort of very quickly get a bunch of nuclear power. If you wanted to like expand low carbon energy very quickly to many regions, without necessarily waiting the 15 years to stand up all those regulatory regimes. I think this idea of the nuclear power ship is kind of interesting. Of course, there's a downside too, which is that if someone, there's a lack of stability. Like if someone pays that company more money, they could just hoist anchor and leave you without your power plant. So there's kind of a risk in there, but still kind of an interesting concept.
Yeah. Well, something I wanted to come back to, I'm very interested in this role of energy in society, civilization, and I guess there's generally you take it for granted in the developed world that you're going to have power to be able to turn the lights on, and certainly when you go to developing countries and they have load shedding and times of the day when things aren't working, you can't turn the air conditioning on, etc. It really stands out as quite troublesome, because that's quite fundamental to building infrastructure, to building any kind of industry, to actually just have reliable power. And it becomes a political question, and I hope you don't mind if we go into this, but the world obviously is a political place, and
yeah, that's fine.
We talk about the United States, which has some, I mean, the US is quite blessed with its energy abundance, but there's other parts of the world that are not, and certainly we've seen wars and historical challenges around energy access, including here in Asia, and so I'm just wondering. From an engineering perspective, we can see the benefits and some of the challenges and how they can be overcome with nuclear. But through the political lens, the supply chains of uranium, the inability to monetize that supply chain like the US can with oil, etc. Do you think there's maybe things operating at a higher level that are maybe holding back nuclear? Or do you see there being just systems in place that are sort of retarding its development? Or is it just it's sort of an emergent phenomena that it's been difficult to roll out nuclear? It's sort of a few different things, but if I throw that at you, sort of the political considerations.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think there is a That's well, I mean, I'll just go,
Yeah.
I'll start like back in the 50s. So, at least in the 50s, I mean, there was this idea that the US President Eisenhower started Atoms for Peace. And Atoms for Peace's purpose was to spread nuclear power plants and the knowledge of peaceful nuclear power everywhere around the world. And and the US went on these journeys, and it was some people say it was part of the Cold War. This was like the counterpoint to the arms race with the Soviet Union, win hearts and minds. But we did, I mean, the US went and built, and I mean, we shipped reactors to Europe. We had all sorts of interesting conventions all around the world. We took reactors and we trained people. We gave people uranium and we taught them how to build and operate nuclear plants. And so at that time, we were really serious about getting everybody to like build nuclear plants and, work with the United States. But like things, I don't know, I don't see too much of that anymore. Like, and there could be an argument made that like maybe some people are so concerned about like weapons proliferation that they don't want other countries to start nuclear programs unless they like really push for it. Like the UAE really wanted it and has is a very rich country and was able to kind of make it happen. But maybe I don't have any evidence for this, but like I'm sure there's some forces politically trying to sort of dissuade too much nuclear power, peaceful nuclear power from sort of going out there. And maybe that's another reason that like costs have stayed high. But really, I mean, that may be a stretch. Like I really think that the real problem is just that we haven't been able to reliably deliver nuclear power plants and operate them in a way that's reliable and cost effective enough. And so if you're a developing country, you only have so much money, you can't put $30 billion into a power plant that's going to take way too long and not operate all the time, because then you end up right back where you are, but you just lost a bunch of money. And so I think there's just a lack of faith in people's ability to build these. Now you can go and you can have Russia come in. They will build one of their nuclear plants in your country, and they will own it and they will operate it from within your country, and they will do it for cheap. And like that's a pretty interesting deal for a lot of countries. But of course, now they have now they control you because they can shut their plant down, whatever. And so a lot of people don't want that kind of an arrangement. But at least the Russians are pretty good. They've serialized production. They can build nuclear plants for cheap. And China's getting good at that now as well. And so maybe like if the US isn't going to be able to build plants cheaply and deliver them, then maybe other countries will pick it up. And that's like a big debate right now as well, because Poland put a bid out to get reactors, and like the Koreans bid on it and the Americans bid on it. And when they chose the Koreans, the Americans were like, wait a minute, that's our intellectual property anyway. So like Westinghouse kind of threw this weird curveball trying to get the Koreans to not be able to do it. So there's certainly a lot of politics involved, but yeah, I do think it's mostly just like if we got really good at building them, then we would see a much larger and faster expansion of them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just pulling on that, Nick, though, it seems like you mentioned Russia. There's the Belt and Road Initiative that China's rolling out with infrastructure. Yep. And again, I think, and for me, I'm not in the US. I don't get access to that cheap power, and we're paying hideous rates here in Japan for electricity. And so there is a sort of real politic here where the ability to get energy for your country is limited because you're sort of you don't have natural gas resources in a certain country. Coal has these climate implications, and maybe there's regulatory issues around that as well. So it's kind of like, well, you're between a rock and a hard place potentially. Yeah. Nuclear is the option that you can come and set up without natural gas pipelines.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like
Oh, I was gonna say, well, let me ask, like, you're in Japan. I mean, Japan obviously built up they are fully capable of building and operating nuclear plants. Obviously, they had a bad accident at Fukushima, but like and they have turned on 11 or 12 of their reactors at this point. But do you see, like, what's the politics there? Like, they could just turn those reactors on. But
Yeah.
obviously, there's like a fear and a politics behind the reason they
Yeah.
haven't.
Well, I had a nuclear engineer on the show who works for the Japanese, for TEPCO, which is a
Yeah.
Japanese electrical utility, and we had a good chat about it. And yeah, it is still a lot of public perception. Also, I think a lot of international perception as well of what happened. I mean, I've been to Fukushima. I haven't been to that place, but I've been to Fukushima myself, and
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of, again, it's mysterious, it's invisible. People don't understand how radiation works, how it floats around, etc. And so there's just a lot of kind of boogeyman type stuff, which has a chilling effect. Because you can't see it, but at the same time you can also point to it and say, yeah, that it came from this place. Whereas the coal, which Japan is importing, and the natural gas, which is very expensive, that it's also importing, you can't necessarily see the particulate either, but you can't really point to it and say it's coming from this place. So it's kind of like a lot of perception and a lot of emotion. And sorry, I'm not articulating it very well, but
No, yeah.
it's sort of, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I don't quite understand. Like, I mean, you're right. Like, the invisibility of radiation makes it extra scary, but it does seem like I would sort of think air pollution would be very similar to like radiation, but it's not. Like, no one's afraid of like particulate emission from coal. Like, even though it's much more deadly, again, 8 million people are dying per year from that kind of thing, whereas up to one person has died from radiation at Fukushima. So, like, why are people so, and not to turn it around anymore, why is radiation so much more scary than inhaling smoke?
Well, that's where I think it comes back to this political thing where, again, you're an engineer, you appreciate that there's a mechanical system, there's scientific processes at play here that we can understand, but for the public, they respond to the emotional, and it becomes a geopolitical thing. There's concerns being pushed from Korea and China around what if the Japanese gone and done. We're sharing these oceans and Fukushima fish and all of these things, which are kind of straw men potentially for what has actually taken place.
Yeah. Well, and that like really annoyed me because you probably know this, but like the amount of tritium, so the Fukushima tritiated water, the amount of tritium in all of that water, like every single nuclear plant in China emits that much every year into the oceans. And like just through normal operation, because tritium is very hard to contain and some of it just leaks. And it's such a low level that it's like well within every regulation. And all of those plants emit far more than is in those tanks at a much more dilute level. So it's truly ridiculous. Like, I did see a bunch of the protests from China and South Korea and others in California, sort of just like really pressuring Japan. But it's so ridiculous because, again, like as a scientist, like I go and look up the numbers and I see what the concentrations of tritium are in that water, and they're so far below like any semblance of any kind of dangerous value. Even straight out of the tanks, you can drink it and it's still far below any safety limit levels. But yet still, Japan is getting sort of bullied by people, it's a shame. And I tried to speak out against it, but I don't have the voice needed compared to the millions of people who are like, tritium in the ocean, so bad.
Yeah. Well, this is my challenge because I think the more pernicious piece, Nick, is not natural gas, but actually this emphasis and dogma towards renewable energy in the sense of solar and wind. And, if I talk to people, and I've had a lot of energy people on the show, and if I talk to the public or people who don't know anything about this space, I think, well, why don't we just build more solar and more wind? And you and I obviously know the problems there with variability, but the public don't understand that. And so we actually end up in this political place, which I hope we can maybe explore together, which is that the public don't understand how these things work, and they are pushing for solar and wind, and yet those things aren't going to be enough to satisfy civilization. And so we end up in this kind of very nihilistic kind of, use less power, shut down industry, kind of civilization starts to go backwards, basically, because we don't have reliable base load. And these are all of these sustainable development goals, kind of 2050 targets and stuff. So throwing that at you, I mean, how does that all, the kind of the climate activism of, remove all of the base load and go to solar, how does that affect the long-term conversation?
Yeah, I mean, that's another major change. I mean, besides the fracking stuff, the wind and solar, the expansion and growth and improvement in production cost. I mean, they have, it has the cost of producing a solar cell and a wind turbine did fall, significantly, factors of 10 over 12 years or so. And that's been a major shift. And yes, they enjoy almost universal acceptance. I mean, at one point it was like 90% of people support more solar and 80% of people support more wind. Of course, once you get a bunch of solar and wind in your area, those numbers start changing because of NIMBYism. But yeah, I mean, it's been a major overall shift. And most of the academics and most of the conversations are all about sort of, yes, let's just expand wind and solar and maybe batteries or maybe hydrogen, and that'll just solve all of these problems in a way that's like
magically
equitable. Yeah. Never mind like the fact that like there's people talk about like, oh, you can't even say the sun sets every night because it's just like ridiculed anymore, even though it is like this fundamental major issue with that type of power. But like then you start talking about seasons. I mean, Japan, I've lived in Seattle, high latitude locations have major seasonal shifts. And so now, if you can get 100% of your electricity on a sunny day in the summer, but like you're still doing pretty bad on average or in the winter. So yeah, I mean, the total systems cost of decarbonizing while staying reliable at scale, I think there is a lot of understanding now. It used to be, and wind and solar batteries can do it all, but that I think is losing some of its true believers. There have been plenty of system studies that show that if you have a certain amount of what we call, thanks to Jesse Jenkins, clean, firm power, which is like something like nuclear or geothermal or something that has those characteristics, then it's much, much easier, much, much cheaper, much more reliable to decarbonize deeply at scale. So I think that's a fairly consensus opinion at this point. I don't know how the politics are in different places, but like in nuclear power, for that reason, is one of the only like bipartisan issues in the United States right now. Like pretty much it's supported roughly equally on both in both of our two parties. So that's kind of interesting, but it's still, I mean, there still is like a major contingent of people who don't want any nuclear and will fight against it and will sue anyone who tries to build one because they just want wind and solar. So there's like very aggressive commentators who will throw that story at anyone who tries to do anything nuclear. So that is still a problem.
Yeah, interesting. Well, just on that note then, and again, this is moving into that political space, but just the reality, the physical reality that, we need to have energy to keep the lights on and have industry. That's sort of, at what point does that butt up against ideology? And I think the ideology I talk about, we know of as this kind of activist type projects that sort of, do sit-ins and stop, the construction of, say, a nuclear plant, or that there's some sort of lawfare or, litigation against the development of this, because solar and wind can't fulfill that baseload need. And so there's sort of, at what point does that reality kick in? And what my concern is that, there's a lot of political instability, a lot of sort of stuff happening in the world right now, and it's sort of like the last thing you need is to have unreliable energy as well.
Yeah.
And so how are we working? Because clearly we can't convince everyone of the scientific and complexity of the safety aspects, right? That's a long format conversation. There's no soundbite, right?
Right.
How do we? Is it coming back to the economics? Do we have to kind of have a hard time first and have high prices before people start considering?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a race against that. Like either that is going to happen. So, and maybe people point to the deindustrialization of like Germany, where electricity prices went so high that many industries are sort of saying like we can't run at these levels. So people are starting to point at places like that. So maybe, I mean, I've certainly thought that yes, it may take some hard times. Maybe we have to be sitting in the dark for a while before we start asking ourselves. Like you said, we all take it for granted. Like my power hasn't gone out for years, and it's just, which is like kind of absurd. Like it's crazy that it hardly ever goes out. But once it starts going out, then people will very quickly start changing their tune. And I mean, reliability is essential. People die every time the power goes out for various reasons, especially in bigger blackouts. But like I said, it's sort of a race because maybe we can, again, if we can get better at building nuclear and build nuclear fast enough, then maybe we can deploy it at a rate that will be able to sort of swoop in before things get particularly bad. And I mean, we can do stuff to make it reliable. Like everybody can install a generator. I walk up and down the street, everybody has a generator, like which was never a thing, but now, after a couple power outages, people go out and buy a diesel generator, and that's terrible for the environment, but that's a thing that people will do as this kind of thing happens. Of course, only like you can only do it if you can afford it. So it hurts the people who can't, which
Mm.
is
And I'm just
unfortunate.
wondering, with the developments coming out of China, Russia, South Korea, and I guess to the US as well. I mean, what are the timeframes currently around development? If you take away, I mean, I guess including the regulatory side. I mean, how long would it take to go from zero to nuke in a country?
I mean, I think the best way to estimate future things is look at the closest thing in the past and just use that number. So like, I mean, 15 years, I think
15.
is, yeah, I think you can go from 0 to 4 gigawatts of nuclear power in 15 years pretty reasonably. You could probably go faster if you really wanted to, if you had, if you could clear all the hurdles. But like 15 years, I think is like a pretty reasonable from 0 to 4 big reactors, and you
Okay.
can build a lot more after that. But I
Yeah.
think that's kind of
It's a long
that's
time.
roughly, yeah. I mean,
Long time to wait. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and sometimes I mean it takes some reactors have taken that long to build. Just building the reactor has taken 15 years in some cases. I mean, the reactors have even taken longer. But yeah,
Mm.
it's not a great answer.
No,
Um,
no.
but it's also like it's kind of a long-term thing. I mean, a lot of these people are putting up gas turbines now that it would be nice to shut down before they reach end of their life. Those things can last for
Mm.
30 years, no problem.
Yeah.
So, and a nuclear plant these days will last 60 or 80 or some say even 100 years. So it's like a pretty long-term investment. And I mean, they're expensive to build, but once they're built, they operate relatively cheaply. You don't have to pay for the mile-long train of coal every day. So the fuel costs are very low and the
Mm.
operation costs are pretty low. So it's a good investment if you can afford that upfront cost and it pays dividends for many years.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
it is a daunting if you have no nuclear and you want to go into it, it's sort of a long haul.
Yeah, so what we may think of it then, it's for people with a low time preference who are thinking long term.
Yes.
Nuclear is the solution, and
Yeah.
and I guess what are your thoughts as well? Just Microsoft recently has talked about 3 Mile Island. Do you
hmm
have any commentary on that? The reactivation of that?
Yeah, I mean it's just going to show like that's another reason that people are starting to sort of doubt the just wind, solar, and batteries concept is now that we have power demand, we're looking at increasing how much electricity we need again, which we haven't seen for years because driven by AI data centers. They need and these well-funded or rich tech companies all care about climate and they all have serious climate commitments and all their employees are and all their shareholders are saying like how are you going to get this electricity without hurting the climate? And so we've done this like you can trade renewable energy credits where you can like say I'll pay that renewable generator over there money and I'll take electricity from my grid, even though it's not all renewable. But because I paid everything for that renewable thing, I can say I'm 100% renewable, even though I'm not. Well, they've run out of renewable energy places to do credits for. And there's no way that they will be able to continue doing that because we can't build renewables and the associated transmission lines fast enough. And so now they're saying we need huge chunks of low carbon baseload electricity. Where are we going to get it? And so they're looking to nuclear because it's the only place they have else to look. And the easiest nuclear plant to get up and running is one that just shut down recently and is sitting there ready to turn back on. And so they just have said, hey, hey utility, hey Constellation, like let's just turn it back on, and we'll pay you a huge amount of money, a huge premium, way more than, the commodity cost of that electricity, because we care about the fact that it's baseload and that it's zero carbon electricity, and we're willing to pay, this much. And yeah, Constellation's like, sure, we can do it. We got 20 other plants. They know what to do. And so they're doing it. They're going to turn it back on. And so now we're talking about finding other recently deactivated nuclear plants to turn back on. Of course, there's only so many. Only a handful maybe could be done. Palisades in Michigan is another one.
Yeah.
But at some point, we're going to have to build again. And I've been told that in the US we will hear the next announcement of a new construction of a new a big light water reactor, like the ones we just built two in Georgia for obscene amounts of money, that $30 billion, and someone's going to order another one of those, I hear. So maybe, and that's probably driven by this idea that like the AI companies are going to be willing to pay extra. So
Yeah.
like it makes it, you can take the risk again.
Yeah. I guess just sort of a few last questions for you, Nick. But in terms of then understanding there's an engineering side to this and a political side, within the US or globally, who are the think tanks and who are the advocates and who are the people who are looking at this and talking about what it could mean beyond just the companies manufacturing themselves? Who's out there sharing the nuclear story?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I know mostly like US based folks, but there are a number of organizations that are out there promoting stuff. So like the first one that comes to mind is called Generation Atomic. So run by Eric Meyer, and it's a bunch of volunteers who have come together. I was on the board for them for 2 years or so. Great organization. They set up events and do different outreach and so on. And then there's a group running out of Diablo Canyon nuclear plant in California called Mothers for Nuclear, and they do a lot of stuff. There's a bunch of nonprofits that are pro-nuclear. There's something called the Clean Air Task Force. There's the Breakthrough Institute is very pro-nuclear. And just, yeah, let's see who else is out there. Lots of people. What is nuclear.com?
Yeah.
That's just me.
Yeah. Well,
And
I must say, though, it sounds like, I mean, that relatively volunteer grassroots type stuff, not perhaps as well funded as maybe some of the advocacy for solar and wind,
oh yeah,
potentially.
totally. It's totally grassroots. I mean, there are some big funders behind some of the, like there's some, wealthy people who have given money to some of those organizations, but they're totally they're grassroots. Everyone I just listed is basically grassroots.
Yeah.
There's no like Greenpeace or Sierra Club at the moment that really supports nuclear. In fact, those guys oppose nuclear
Oh,
famously.
really?
Oh yeah, I mean,
Greenpeace, yeah.
Greenpeace says utter falsehoods about nuclear all the time, and
Oh, really?
I like, yeah, they say things like that it's really high carbon if you look at the life cycle. And I have like some of my most liked tweets are like showing data that refutes a Greenpeace associated person saying that nuclear is actually high carbon when it's really not. And they say all sorts of things, like they said something about at Fukushima. They said the carbon-14 in the tritium water is going to change human DNA. And I like looked into it and did the math on it. And it was like, it's like 1,000th of the carbon-14 that's generated naturally by the sun in the atmosphere every day. I mean, it's just totally ridiculous. Yeah. So I'm like I'm real mad at, I mean, the volunteers of Greenpeace I've met are all great people. And when I talk to them, they're super cool and they care about stuff. But the position of Greenpeace as a crazy anti-nuclear org has been very frustrating. So yeah, there's a bunch of the anti-nuclear institutions of the world are dramatically more organized and better funded than the pro-nuclear grassroots people.
I find that very fascinating. Sorry, I'm not to drag it out, but that stands out to me as something quite profound, that these organizations would be against it, and it's really just maybe a few volunteers and grassroots organizations and people like yourself putting in time to actually write articles about this. And yet it's this miracle technology. It's not just a rock that you burn or some gas in the ground. It's like it's splitting atoms. It's a miracle.
Yeah,
and why aren't we doing it? Why are they so against it?
Yeah, I mean, the history there, it came from nuclear weapons. They were anti-nuclear weapons, which is a totally reasonable. I can support that. Like opposing nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere and just nuclear weapons as a concept is like a fine thing. I can totally understand. But like when they had success there, they just sort of seamlessly transitioned into anti-nuclear power they didn't have to change their slogans, no nukes, no nuclear. Like it just
Yeah. It's like they needed something. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, they had the momentum and they just kept going with it or something. I mean, the Sierra Club used to be pro-nuclear. They were anti-coal pro-nuclear and then they switched. They became anti-nuclear back I think in
Yeah.
the late 60s or so.
Yeah. Well, and I mean that reflects the story of my home country, New Zealand, as well. Which I mean, there was unfortunately a lot of nuclear testing in the South Pacific, and
Hmm.
that kind of seamlessly bled into questions around nuclear-powered warships and
Yep.
nuclear weapons on warships, and then
Hmm.
everything that had the nuclear word in there got associated. But
Yeah.
look. I guess finally, then Nick, if people do want to learn more and they want to educate themselves about nuclear, who are the voices who are sharing the information? Obviously, the whatisnuclear.com is a great resource, but where else can people go in terms of podcasts or, yeah.
Yeah, let's see. So, this isn't self-promotion. There's some great podcasts. So like there's a podcast out of Canada called Decouple
Yes.
Podcast, which is really good. I'm actually on it. Like I have a double header right now. I'm doing two episodes, but I've listened to a lot of they've had really interesting people
Yeah.
on. I mean, it's sort of, Western focused, but they talk about all sorts of the major issues. And so that's a really good one. There's someone named Isabel Bohomiki, who's the world's first nuclear influencer. She's from
Oh,
Brazil and became interested in nuclear. Like she's a professional model, but she got into nuclear and she started producing like pretty creative and interesting like TikToks and Instagrams and dances and like cool. So it's a different style of nuclear communication, targeting people that like I could never reach. But she's super intelligent and she's got a book coming out and she has a really good platform, a lot of cool stuff. So her like handle is isodope, like ISODOPE. But so that's another great resource. Geez, I'm just drawing a blank. There's a bunch of other great podcasts. Oh, there's one called The Titans of Nuclear, where another US based podcaster interviewed people from around the world, like hundreds of people, 300 and something people were interviewed on that podcast, all again really interested. They interviewed a guy from South Korea who sort of saw South Korea. He tells the story of how South Korea started in nuclear and like built it up over the years. It's really utterly fascinating. So I've learned a ton through those kind of podcasts. Yeah, so
yeah.
those are a few that I can think of. There's so many. I mean, there are a lot of great resources. I
Yeah.
do have like I have a couple like there's a whatisnuclear.com reading list where
Okay.
I don't know, like there's too many sections, but it's in like reference reading list or something. And I try to put a link. I have links to these podcasts. I have a bunch of textbooks on there and just sort of some other publications. So I do have like that page to sort of collect what I think are some cool resources to
Yeah.
go find more.
Yeah. And Nick, what's next for you? What have you got up on your horizon?
Oh, I mean, so I don't know. I have worked at TerraPower for 15 years and it's been really great. I mean, my plan is to keep doing that. We do have a pretty interesting reactor that just is starting construction in Wyoming. So I'm involved in the again the like the digital side of that reactor, which is pretty cool because it's not often that you get to be involved in sort of the construction and design of a new type of nuclear reactor. So I want to see that through. So I plan to keep doing that. I also have interests in, I mean, there's like things I want to do associated with like my What is Nuclear public wing. I've been digitizing a bunch of old nuclear films, which I
Yeah.
think are really cool. Like that's another form of education in a sense. But I think there's a big opportunity to collaborate more within the nuclear industry. So I have this like dream of I don't know, making like kind of an open source type project where different nuclear companies or people who want to get into the nuclear business could join in and get just like share work on kind of dumb sounding things like procedures, like writing the procedures to run a nuclear plant or design a nuclear plant sounds dumb, but like what's the point in having 50 different companies write 50 different sets of procedures when you could just write like one really good set and share it and collaborate on it? So I have some interest in like trying to facilitate something like that sort of out in the community. So, but that's focusing on like what I think are some of the major cost drivers in like getting into nuclear, even though it's kind of fringy. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I'll be trying.
That sounds pretty awesome. Open source. I'm a big open source fan, and I think that it could certainly be an interesting approach. And how that meshes with corporate interests and political interests would be very interesting. But that
Yeah.
sounds really awesome. And one final question for you, Nick.
Mhm.
Is that a flux capacitor on your
Yeah,
wall?
yeah, that is, yes. I made a flux capacitor many years ago. It used to be in my car, and I had it wired in there. Yeah, so it's just a bunch of LEDs on little decade counters with a 555 timer.
Yeah,
I made it, geez, it must have been 2006 or something. I sat there and soldered it all together.
yeah,
Big fan of Back to the Future. And having just moved, I was able to wire it into instead of it being battery powered, I finally
yeah.
wired it in. I thought it'd be a cool background. So yes, that was nuclear powered, of course, in the movie.
Yeah, 1.21 gigawatts.
That's right.
Is that how you say it? Yeah.
Yep, yep.
Awesome. Well, look, Nick, if people want to find you, obviously whatisnuclear.com is your website. If they want to find you, though, on social, where can they go?
Yeah, like I have that what is nuclear handle basically wherever I am. I'm
Okay.
mostly on X/Twitter. Like that's where I've been most active. I do have a Blue Sky now. It's just whatisnuclear.com. And I'm not active really on Instagram or TikTok, but I've been told that I need to be. So I'm like thinking about figuring out how to get there because like the younger people are not on the other places. But yeah, just what is nuclear is kind of my brand, so to speak. So
Yeah, yeah.
that's the main place.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, man. I think you're a great communicator, great educator. So yeah,
Oh,
having
thank you.
more of your voice out there would be awesome. But I appreciate your time,
Yeah,
and
of
all of the
course.
work.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
No, and all of the work you've done. I mean, it is a complex topic, and I feel like we touched a few different topics, but certainly I'm interested in what this could mean for humanity longer term. And yeah, I appreciate your input.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good conversation.
Thank you for listening. I am Cody Allingham, and that was the transformation of value. If you would like to support this show, please consider making a donation either through my website or by directly tipping to the show's Bitcoin wallet, or just pass this episode on to a friend who you think may enjoy it. And you can always email me at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com.